reflected on its accounting books at its current value. Let me give you an example. Suppose you own a stock of XYZ, okay, and you bought it at $100. Now, on your books, on your accounting books, you know, do you write $100? No, you write the price of that security at the date of that accounting period. So, for instance, for the sake of argument, suppose you bought this in the year 2000 at $100 a share, and in 2005, you know, XYZ had risen to $150. So, for 2005 accounting period, you write down that it's worth $150 on your accounting book. That's mark to market. But today, for the sake of argument, let's assume that XYZ made some bad deals, bad choices, and, you know, a bunch of lawsuits, and now that stock is worth, rather than $100 like when you bought it, it's worth, say, $20. Well, mark to market says that you have to write down on your accounting books, you know, the price of the stock as it is worth today. Now, in March of 2009, the Fed allowed some of the banks, the famed too big to fail banks, to eliminate the FASB 157 rule of mark to market. So they don't have to put the price of their bonds to the mark to market value. They can write it whatever they want, which of course people started calling it mark to make believe or mark to fantasy. You know, you bought XYZ at $100, and maybe now it's only worth $5. But guess what? Since FASB 157 has been suspended, you can write on your books that's worth $100, even though nobody on the face of the planet would pay you $100 for it. That's why this is such a key rule. Now, it seems trivial, but what has happened is that it has allowed the too big to fail banks, which are insolvent. I mean, they're bankrupt because the assets they own are not worth what they paid for them. Well, it's allowed them to technically remain solvent. And the Federal Reserve and the federal government have been trying to pump up money into these banks in order to save them. Now, the Fed has been providing liquidity to the banks at 0% interest rates. Okay, and this is given banks a chance to borrow for nothing from the Fed and lend to the federal government to cover up the huge treasury bond. This is what's known as stealth monetization. Okay, this is how the federal government and the Federal Reserve have been trying to prop up the insolvent banking system ever since September of 2008. Now, QE Light, which has been the subsequent effort at monetization, has been an effort that, you know, the Fed went and bought up a bunch of toxic assets, gave the banks fresh money that it, you know, invented out of thin air. The banks took that money and went and bought treasury bonds, and this is stealth monetization. But the Fed had on its balance sheet these toxic assets. These toxic assets continue to produce dividends and exceedance, and so with these exceedance, the Fed has been buying more treasury bonds. Okay, so you see how the Federal Reserve has been helping to finance the federal government's deficit. Now, what is the objective of the Fed? It is to bring more cash and credit to the American economy and therefore reignite consumption and demand. Now, this in and of itself, these are not bad aims. The problem is that the way that the Federal Reserve has been doing this has been pernicious. It's a little bit like giving a drug addict, you know, and you're trying to wean him off heroin. You start giving him more heroin. You know, that's what's been going on here. You give him more heroin, and you give him a nice apartment where he can live, and you give him, you know, a stipend of $3,000 a month on top of the free drugs that you're giving him. That is what the Federal Reserve has been doing to the banking system. Now, as far as the effects of the federal government policies are concerned, during 2009 and 2010, the economy basically tread water. You know, there was no real critical mass, but, you know, there was no crisis event either. And because of all these measures, the stimulus, QE Light, the suspension of FASB 157, you know, the economy has been sort of like stumbling along. But U3 unemployment has been rising. You know, it peaked out at 9.8 practically. U6 is just shy of 17%. And if you notice, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, how, you know, employment is sort of coming down, you know, unemployment is coming down, you know, things might be getting better. But if you start looking at the granular detail of the numbers, there's no improvement. You know, it's basically flat in a very bad way. Okay. Now, throughout this, you've had 0% interest rates, or practically 0% interest rates, and you have commodity prices that are steadily rising. Now, this is ominous. Okay. Now, a consequence of cheap Fed money is that commodities are rising. Gold and silver are the obvious example, but also oil and agricultural products. Rising commodity prices have an inevitable effect on consumer prices, obviously. Producers aren't raising prices yet. They are making products smaller. because producers realize that they cannot raise prices. Okay, because if they raise prices in this weakened economy that we're currently living in, they're going to lose customers. So they prefer to basically try to sell the same income, and pay a little bit more, and for them to absorb the losses, or to start selling their products in smaller quantities. You're going to notice if you go to Walmart, a lot of things that if you've been paying attention, and I never pay attention to this kind of stuff. Somebody pointed out to me that, coffee, the containers of coffee are getting smaller. There used to be 39 ounces, and now they're 33.9 ounces, and yet roughly at the same price. So you say, hey, well, there hasn't been inflation. Coffee's still selling, $10, for the little package, right? But actually, the package is smaller. That's stealth inflation, because producers are trying not to scare off their customers. Okay. Now, finally, the thing that we had last November, which was the big thing, was QE2. QE2 is like, basically, it's monetization of the federal government. Monetization is when the central bank starts printing money, making money out of thin air for the government to spend on whatever, on bridges and salaries and, weapon systems and all the rest of it. Now, QE2, what was it? It was the Federal Reserve, will buy 600 billion in treasury bonds in monthly increments of 75 billion over the next 8 months. Okay, that was starting in November. Now, starting in November of 2010, every month they're buying, roughly 75 billion. The problem what we're having is that these numbers are so huge that we sort of like lost sight of what they actually mean. You've got to keep in mind that in the 1980s, the entire deficit, yearly deficit, was less than 75 billion. And the Fed is printing that every month. Okay, so you got to keep, try to keep this in mind as to the magnitude of this. Now, what's key about the November announcement of the Fed, introducing QE2 is that it left the door open for more and larger purchases of treasury bonds by the Fed. Now, as I said before, QE Light is, the Fed is already buying about 35 billion a month in treasuries. Now, altogether, I wrote a piece about this. You add it all up, and the Fed is roughly going to be monetizing about half of the federal government deficit for fiscal year 2011. That is, they are printing money, making it out of thin air, half of that deficit, of that 1.6 trillion. Okay, now two things you got to note here. Okay, more money has been pumped into the economy than has been drained from the economy. Between the stimulus, QE1, QE Light, and QE2, the federal government and the Federal Reserve have flooded the U.S. economy with money. They have pumped roughly $3 trillion into the economy, compared to the approximately $2 trillion that contracted due to the credit collapse of the global financial crisis. Okay. Now, here is a key point. Interest rates cannot rise because the economy is simply too weak. If interest rates were to rise and made it more expensive for the federal government to finance its debt, the federal government would go bankrupt. Okay. Now, therefore, inflation cannot be contained by raising interest rates, which is the traditional way to control hyperinflation or inflation or rising inflation. Interest rates are the key. It is the main tool, frankly, the only tool to shore up a fiat currency. Parentheses here. A lot of people say that a fiat currency is evil, the work of the devil. We should, fiat is an evil thing. I personally don't think that. I think that a fiat currency is actually can be a good thing if it is managed properly. It's a little bit like owning a gun. You can own a gun, and it can be a very useful tool if it is handled and managed properly. Of course, if you give a gun to a fool or a crazy man or a child, of course you're gonna suffer terrible consequences. But if you manage a gun responsibly, you keep it stored, away from small children, and you use it in a responsible manner when appropriate, a gun is perfectly harmless. I have the same opinion insofar as fiat currency is concerned.
Now, Gonzalo,
go ahead.
Yeah, mind if I'm gonna bust in here with a quick question for you. Given what you've just shared with us, and I think the members of the Elevation Group are quite aware of many of these trends, but it's hard to believe that people at the Federal Reserve and the government that we have in control and in power these days, I just can't help but ask myself, are they really that stupid?